when you have to factor a trinomial and your a value is not 1, we need a different method than what I've showed you previously. We could try to check for a greatest common factor, and like we did in the other video, although for these two examples we will see that there isn't one. So let's deal with how to factor a trinomial when your a value is not 1, and there is no GCF besides 1. So what I'm going to do is I called it the box method. So start with drawing a box, a 2x2 square. Punnett square, if you are into biology, it's sort of your window into the world of factoring if you want to be super nerdy about it. But here's how it works. Take your first term, which is 2x squared, and write that in the first box. And then take your last term and write it in the last box. And then go ahead and multiply those two values together. And while it's not necessary to write the number down, I like to just for reference, so I usually write that in the corner. So what I need to do is I need to finish filling out the box with two more numbers. This part should sound familiar to you. Two more numbers that multiply to 6 and add up to -7. So similar to what we did before, although we're multiplying to 6 this time. So like we did last time, if you need to make your list of factors, then go ahead and do that. The two numbers that multiply to 6 and add up to -7 are going to be -1 and -6. It doesn't matter where those two numbers go, just make sure they're both negative and include x's with those values, okay? Your last step of this process, now that the box is filled out, is you want to look across rows and up and down columns to look for greatest common factors. So looking across this bottom row, between -6x and 3, both numbers are divisible by a 3, and you always want your signs on the outside to match, so I'm going to make both of those negative. Across the top row, I've got 2x squared and -1x. The only thing those have in common is an x, or a 1x, so I'll factor an x out. Now do the same thing going up and down columns. So looking at -6x squared and -6x and +2x squared, both numbers can be divisible by 2, and they both have an x in common, so I'm going to factor out a 2x. And then finally, -1x and 3, they don't have anything in common, but don't forget we can always divide by 1, and since I want my signs on the outside to match, I'm going to take out a -1. Those numbers you've written down on the outside are your factors. So I've got 2x minus 1 as a factor, and then x minus 3 as my other factor. And then as we've discussed in other videos, if you want to solve that or check that, you could graph on a calculator, graph your answer, graph the original, see if they're the same parabola, or just use the box method to remultiply this. And if you use the box method, you'll see that it's really just repeating what we did up here, but in reverse. Because remember, all factoring is multiplying in reverse. So let me show you one more example, although this would be a great time to pause the video and try on your own if you want to see if you got the idea. Otherwise, let it play through and I'll show you one more example right now. Before we do a couple more with greatest common factors after this. So anytime that you're dealing with a trinomial where your a value is not 1, draw the factor box. Start with your first term in the first box, so 2x squared, and your last term in the last spot, and multiply those two values together. So 2 times -7 is -14. What we need to do is find two more numbers that multiply to -14, and at the same time add up to +13. Now because you need to multiply to something negative, I know my signs need to not match. I need to have one positive and one negative. So if you write down your options, we've got 1 and 14 and 2 and 7. Knowing that I need to multiply to a negative, one of those numbers needs to be negative. And the only option that's going to work to get a +13 when I add is going to be to do that. So let's go with a -1 and a +14. Now remember, those numbers don't matter where they go, so -1, +14. All that matters is that the signs are correct and then they have x values with them. Okay, and if you remember, the last part of this process was to look for a greatest common factor. So look across rows and look up and down columns for what numbers can be divided by. Be careful, I have a lot of people want to tell me there's a 2 right here because they look for what 14 divided by 7 is, and that's not what we're doing. We're looking for what both numbers can be divided by, and they can both be divided by a 7. And it's positive because I want my signs to match. Along the top row, those only have an x in common. Your x's should always be in the corner. If I look up and down this column, they have a 2x squared in common, and finally -1x and -7 have nothing in common, but I can always take a 1 out, and since I want my signs to match, I'll take out a -1. So my factors here are 2x minus 1 and x plus 7. And again, the order that you write those factors in does not matter. always make sure that you check for a greatest common factor before you just jump right into factoring. So this time we don't have a 1 in front, although before you just go and do the box method, look for that greatest common factor first. So looking between negative 26 and 12, all of those numbers are divisible by 2. So let's take out the greatest common factor and then do the box method. If you jump right into the box method, not only are you going to be dealing with really large numbers, larger than you need to, but your final answer will not be factored completely, so it won't technically be correct. So look for that greatest common factor first. Also, sometimes what looks like it might take the box method won't, because maybe your greatest common factor will leave you with a 1 in front, so you can use the easier method. Although the box method does work on those other trinomials, it's kind of like overkill. I say it's a lot more work than we need to. So anyway, back to this one. We're going to take a 2 out. So what's left over then is 2x squared minus 13x and then plus 6. Everything's been divided by 2. Now at this point I can see that I will need to use the box method because I do not have a 1 in front of that trinomial. So I will need to use the box method. So ignoring that 2, that's the greatest common factor, let's do what we did a few minutes ago. Start with your first term in the first box and your last term in the last box and multiply those values together. So we need to finish filling this out with 2 numbers that multiply to 12, and at the same time they need to add up to negative 13. So make your list of factors if you need to. Hopefully you're getting really good at doing that in your head though. The factors I'm going to need are a negative 12 and a negative 1. It won't matter where those numbers go, but do make sure you include x's with them. And then to finish out with the box method, we're looking across rows and columns for common factors. So looking along the bottom row, they have a negative 1 in common. And along the top row, I can divide both of those by 2x. And then looking up and down columns, I've got a 1x right there and a negative 6 in that spot. And again, I want my signs on the outside to match, so that's why I chose a negative 6. So my factored answer is going to be those numbers on the outside, so 2x minus 1. And then x minus 6. Don't forget to include the greatest common factor, the GCF we originally took out, which was 2. Otherwise, you've not factored completely. Okay, and then one final one to do. I want to look again for a greatest common factor, and this time I have a lot of people tell me, well, there isn't one, or the only thing we can take out is a 1. And that's true-ish, sort of true, but remember what we've talked about with negative signs in front. You never ever want to have a negative sign in front when you go to factor, and that includes with using the box method. So what we're going to do is, even if the only thing you can take out is a negative 1, do that, so that your signs will change and become positive. So I've got positive 4x squared minus 12x, and then minus 7. You do not want to use the box method with a negative a value. So even like I said, if all you can do is take out a negative 1, then do that so you have a positive a value. So let's go ahead and do the box method one more time. Hopefully it's getting a lot easier. Otherwise, go back and rewatch or pause and try some of these. First term in the first box and last term in the last box. Multiply those together. So I need 2 numbers now that multiply to negative 28 and add up to negative 12. So if you need to make your list, go ahead and make your list. I've got 1 and 28 as options. I've got 4 and 7. Oops, I skipped 1. I've got 2 and 14 as options. Knowing that my signs have to not match, I need one positive sign and one negative sign. The option that I can see is going to work is going to be this one. A negative 2 and a positive 14 will add up to negative 12. So put those in the box, doesn't matter where they go. Just make sure that they are negative, they need to be negative, and they include x's. Look for common factors across rows and columns. Those only have a 1 in common. These can both be divided by 2, and I can get an x out of there. Looking up the columns then, I've got another 2x, and then negative 14 and negative 7 can both be divided by negative 7. So my factors are going to be 2x plus 1 and 2x minus 7. But again, don't forget about the greatest common factor. If you took something out, make sure you put it back at the beginning of your answer.